Alright, welcome to WCHS. Today we're looking at how to do an A1. A1 is the first of the two writing assignments on the diploma exam, and here at Wetaskiwin Composite High School we begin looking at A1 in grade 9 when we have them do some source interpretation, and by grade 10 we end up doing full A1s with our students. So I do have an A1 document from grade 10 up here so we can go through some steps. Also today I'm going to be showing a Prezi that I've created for my grade 12s, and we'll be looking at some of the old grade 12 A1 sources so that we can apply the knowledge that we're gathering here today. So for the A1 process, it's always important to teach your students the steps that they can deploy or use so that they can find success. So in terms of those steps, first thing I'd consider, or first thing I would inform my students, is that they should look at the source and try to see the source as a big picture. What is the theme of this source? And the theme of the source should be connecting with the theme of the course. So in Social 10, the theme is globalization. In 20, the theme is nationalism. In 30, the theme is liberalism. And within those themes, there's other reoccurring topics. Like within 30, you have the role of government, the role of citizen, the relationship between government and citizens, and those sorts of things. So one thing that you can do as you're teaching the course is to keep identifying those reoccurring themes, and as you're teaching those themes, you're preloading what they're going to see on their A1 activity. Also, I'd ask the students to look beyond the big picture of the source and now look at the smaller details of the source. And when we talk about the smaller details of the source, we might call those the big rocks of the course. That's when we would be looking for things like key vocabulary. In Social 30, we would be looking at the principles of liberalism. How is the source either reflecting or rejecting the theme of the course, and within that theme, how is it reflecting or rejecting in Social 30 the principles of liberalism? In 20, how is the source reflecting or rejecting nationalism? In 10, how is it reflecting or rejecting globalism? What values associated with globalization, or what values associated with nationalism, or what values associated with liberalism are being either reflected or rejected here? So that's the first steps of an A1. Looking at it big picture, trying to say, okay, how does it connect with the theme of the course? And then underneath that theme, trying to see the nuances of the course, the big rocks, those reoccurring themes that could be really the main vocabulary of the course. So as you're teaching the course, as you're teaching those vocabulary terms, those big rocks, as you're teaching the main theme of the course or the sub-themes off of that, you could be preloading a lot of what they end up seeing on the A1. Once we've talked about what is on the page, we can now turn our attention to why is it on the page. What's the inspiration behind the source? What inspired this source? Is it a reaction to something? Is there a specific event or issue in history that the source is responding or reacting to? This helps us try to understand the why the source was created part. So once we know what's on the page, we begin to turn our attention to why is it there. Perhaps there's an allusion to a specific historical event or contemporary event. Maybe there's some language within the source that will lead us to the inspiration behind the source. One of the key steps needed in an A1 is to find the ideological perspective of the source. What issue is the source presenting? And does it explicitly state a solution, or is it implicitly on the page? So explicitly, it's right there. It's either in language, or it's in the cartoon or photograph or chart. Implicitly, we can infer based upon what's there the solution that the perspective of the source would like to promote. Do we have any evidence that could further the solution that's being offered? This is a good way to further the perspective of the source. So for example, in grade 10, maybe one of the themes could be that with globalization, nations become vulnerable to public health issues that are global. We can look at details within the source to find that as the problem, but we can further the evidence. Maybe the source, the details within the source is not talking about COVID-19, but we can use COVID-19 as evidence to further the perspective of the source. So even though the source is talking about, public health issues, maybe it's talking about H1N1, or maybe it's talking about pandemics in general, we can use evidence like COVID-19 to further the perspective of the source. We're not writing a research paper, we're not writing an essay, but we're using evidence to further clarify what is the perspective of the source. Also, under the ideological perspective of the source portion of the assignment, we can talk about the proponents of the source and the values associated with the perspective, the values associated with the solution they're presenting. And often these values associated with them will highlight what is their ideal society meant to look like, or what is the future of globalism in grade 10, or to what extent should we be embracing nationalism in grade 11. Underneath this, we'll see the goal of the source. We'll see underneath the idea of the goal of the source, if the goal of the source is to create anarchy, then in Social 30, then what we might want to be considering, then who's the audience? If the goal is to create anarchy, then who's the audience? Who are we targeting with the source so that they can create the goal intended? So who's the audience, what's the intended response, and what is the goal is another way of unpacking the ideological perspective of the source. And when we look at the audience and how they're being targeted, this is where you can get into different ideological perspective tools like, what's the tone of the source. We can also look at the values within the source not being universal. So we can say that there is a division of society surrounding the issue being presented. Would everyone agree with the perspective presented? The answer should be no. So what are the limitations, the biases, the flaws of logic that are being presented within the source that others may argue against? And who are those others, and what evidence would they use to argue against it? So the source, another way to really, in a judicious and precise way, the source is presenting a biased perspective, and it's important for us to break that down and not respond to it personally. That's not the assignment, to say, Russ McBride doesn't like the source, he would value nationalism over globalism, but it would be important for you to unpack the source and say that, nationalists like, and this is where you should be able to show off your understanding of people that you've encountered in class. So keeping a cast of characters will help you with the division of society part of the assignment. So as you're learning about people in class, it's important in your notes to have this is an individual, and this is how they connect to the theme. Do they reflect the theme of the course? Do they reject it, and why? And another thing that we can do in the source is talk about the significance. If left unaddressed, how bad will the problem get? What might happen if the problem goes unresolved? Taken to an extreme, if left unaddressed, proponents of the source may argue that the issue presented will lead to the death of birth, will lead to the end of life in our biosphere because our development is not sustainable, and the externality of economic globalism is killing the thin layer of livable space in the known universe. So we have lots of links here to different lectures on different paragraphs and stuff like that. I can certainly share this out with you if you guys need that. We also have sources here. So here is a source that is from grade 10. So this is an example how even on lesson 2 in grade 10, I begin talking about the different sources. Here's a source from grade 10 that we end up dissecting, and there's a link there to a video on how it was dissected. Here's a related one, and then another related one, and another source, and another link there. So A1 assignments with your kids is a process. You can't just give them a set of 3 sources 2 months into the course and expect them to do well. The assessment needs to be led by the instruction, and the instruction needs to be guided around the assessment. It really truly is an anchor for the course. As you can see here, before we get to a set of sources, we do a number of them together as a class. And then we have sample responses, where we go through the steps, and then we give them an exemplar. And students need the exemplars, especially in grade 9 and 10, because they don't know what the answer is meant to look like. So Very key step. Before you can test them, you need to demonstrate. You need to model what the assignment is expecting them to do. But each topic in 10, each topic in 20, and definitely each topic in 30 lends itself naturally to an opportunity to study sources. And as you study the sources, it's logical that you can use the steps that one would do to unpack them in an A1 assignment. So, lots of sources in there, lots of sources that have been broken down. Some of the sources are a little more complicated than others, and that is quite natural, obviously. But this is a 71-page document for my grade 10s, taking them through the process one source at a time. And I would say that as a teacher, you really need to look at, the big rocks of the course. What is the course about? What are the major things I want to be teaching here? And within those rocks, begin to build your course around sources. That you can teach the content through the sources, and as you demonstrate the sources, you can teach the process. And as you teach the process of an A1, what you're really doing is teaching analytical critical thinking. So, next up, I want to show you a Prezi that I have created for my grade 12s. Now, the Prezi is rather long. I think it's like 119 slides, yeah. And what it does is it goes through the process, and it shows different sets. So, it says, you know what? Do you know how to do this assignment that's worth 20% of the mark? So it shows examples of sources that you could have and said, this is what we do. First step, what is on the page? For example, source 1 is a political cartoon that depicts a presumably Muslim woman covered head to toe in a burqa. So that would be a sentence that they could begin. Source 1 is a political cartoon. So it is a very formulaic assignment, right? So definitely going through what's on the page is important. Another thing in Social 30, the nice thing is that right in the textbook, pages 71 to 85, they talk about the key principles of individualism and collectivism, and these are the principles we should be looking for within the A1 assignment. So how is it reflecting or rejecting these bulleted principles? That is a key part of the assignment. So as I'm teaching the course, obviously I need to be, maybe not daily, but quite often connecting things back to these principles. That we shouldn't go too long in the course not talking about law and order or state control or state security or service to the community, common good, or individualism and rule of law versus law and order and civil liberties and citizen participation. That when we talk about new content, we should be connecting it back to old. And the old content that are the big rocks for an A1 are those principles in 30, pages 71 to 85. What you need to do in 20 and 10 is create your own principles. What are going to be the key principles that reflect and reject the theme of the course that you're presenting? So does the source reflect or reject liberalism? How can we tell? Again, consider the intended audience and what perspective. Are they making an emotional, logical, and ethical, a sarcastic, a cynical, a satirical, an optimistic, a humorous, informative, liberal, conservative, moderate, artistic? What kind of presentation is being made, and why are they presenting it in that format? So before your students can identify what a satirical presentation or a cynical presentation or a sarcastic presentation or a appeal to ethics or an appeal to emotion is, you need to demonstrate that in class. If it's a cartoon, is there a caricature? What is the exaggeration or distortion of a person or object within the cartoon that may provide us the goal of providing a comic effect? Consider symbols and context. We can look at the details within a cartoon and see if it's an allusion to a specific event. So before you can do an A1, there's an entire set of cartoon analysis that you're going to need to do. All right, so that's just that quick set to get us started. But nice thing is we have, and we'll get to relationships in the next video. Nice thing is we have more sets to look at. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit Spin ahead. So we have some, just fast forward it too much. We have some sources here that we can look at. And as we look at them, we will go through the steps together. So we will also be looking at the rubric at the end here as well. So here's a source that they could get in Social 30. Freedom has enslaved many of our socialist brothers. Distracted by the placebo of democracy, capitalism is the terminal disease used by the few to exploit the many. It is therefore our responsibility to resist America and her clones and liberate the hearts and minds of our imprisoned brothers from the relentless tide of Western imperialism. This is a call to arms. If we fail, the world will become an empty shell, all of its resources used in the blind pursuit of individual glory, killing the collective. So that's the source. Lots there to break down, right? So let's break it down. Identify the issue, the problem, the challenge the source is a response to. And the issue here is the paradoxical enslavement caused by freedom. This is some Orwellian speak that freedom is slavery. The term slave has a negative connotation. People do not willingly desire to become a slave, as we explore in Social 10. And this is a significant issue because the victims of said enslavement are our brothers. And we have a familiar responsibility, because they're our brothers, to protect the integrity of our brothers. If our brothers fall, we might be next. First they came for them, and nobody said anything. When they come for me, no one will be left. How big is this issue? Unfortunately, this is not an isolated incident. The relentless tide of Western imperialism. This phrase links and parallels what is happening today with the foreign policy of imperialism. The same policy that will forever be linked with the raping and looting of the New World, Africa and Asia. Imperialism led to the 19th century genocide of the Congolese people, a genocide committed in the name of the selfish pursuit of profit from rubber. So a lot of grade 10 coming back in this source as well. And that shows using evidence to further the language as we break the language down by connecting back to the Congo. Is inaction an option? Can we be neutral in this conflict? If we fail, the world will become an empty shell, all of its resources used in the blind pursuit of individual glory. So no, the earth itself is at risk. The ecological impact of individualism is not sustainable, nonsensical, and can only be supported by those blind to the impact of their actions. Unfortunately, there is a lot of evidence to support this. Climate change, species extinction, non-renewable resource exhaustion becoming the most alarming. Again, grade 10, grade 10, grade 10. So often I build some content in grade 10 that they can then use to reflect back on when they're seeing the theory in 30. And there's more to the cost of inaction. If we fail, the world will become an empty shell. The cost isn't just physical, there is a moral cost of the enslavement. We'll be left empty shells, empty of morality, and we'll become like others, clones of America. Again, paradoxically, we stand to lose our individualism if we take the placebo. A clone is not a desirable identity. No one wants to be a clone. It's someone else's identity, it's not yours. And don't forget that the freedom is linked with being a terminal disease. So we better act to save our lives. And so how has this been possible? Democracy is a placebo, a false cure. We believe that it is a medicine to help us, but the reality is it's only serving to distract us. Elections are not really free. Choice is an illusion. The political parties, the platforms, the candidates have all become puppets of corporate interests. Elections give the exploited a false sense of inclusion. The real game is capitalism. Sadly, our hearts and minds have been lost to the reality that we are being controlled, exploited for another's gain. It is time to awake from the matrix. So this is all the perspective of the source. This is not what I'm prescribing for the world. Who might agree with the perspective? Well, it sounds like Chomsky, Marx, and Rousseau. And how do I know it sounds like Chomsky, Marx, and Rousseau? Well, when I'm teaching in the course, I tell my students, create a cast of characters. What does Chomsky believe? What kind of world does he want to create? What does Marx believe? What kind of world does he want to create? What does Rousseau believe? What kind of world does he want to create? And then when they're presented with a source like this, they can see some of the underpinnings or the echoes of these philosophers. So what might be their prescribed solution? Well, Marx would say the role of the revolutionaries is to break off the chains of oppression, unite with the workers of the world, protect our common interest, and the exploitation due to individual incentive. Rousseau might say private property is the source of jealousy and therefore a divisive force in society that corrupts our natural noble selves. The solution is simple. Reject economic individualism and embrace public property. Public property is the solution to the malaise of modernity. The malaise of modernity is the jealousy that is created where our hearts and minds are corrupted by our competition with our neighbors because we see what they have that we do not and we're jealous. And Chomsky, I said ask Max because I had a former student that really knew a lot about Chomsky that has now created a new communist party here in Canada. And then we say, does it ever work? So in summary, this is a rejection of Smith. It's a rejection of the invisible hand. So this is what's not on the page. This is what they're not embracing, right? So not only are we saying this is what it reflects, but this is what it rejects. So we review the steps that we've just gone through with them. And it's nice to do these practice ones together. These are not easy. So here's another one. The state determines all that is morally, socially, and materially valuable. Therefore, it is the right and obligation to monopolize all power and authority, controlling all aspects of society. The state functions as the protector of citizens, providing them with identities, welfare, and security in return for loyalty and obedience. No rights or freedoms should exist apart from service to the state. Individuals and groups constitute one unified, integral whole working towards common goals. Thus, any notion that liberalism functions for the greater good is naive. So lots of rich language there to break down. Elaborate on key phrases. So when you break down a quote, we really need to, the big rocks of the quote are the words, right? So we really need to focus in on those words. Elaborate on key phrases. When it says the state, you should be thinking critically as opposed to what? It says the state. It doesn't say the individual. It doesn't say the families. It doesn't say church. It says the state does this. So even in the first fragment, the state determines all, a critical thinker is saying, whoa, wait a minute. Why is it the state, not the individual? Why is it the state, not families? Why is it the state and not the church? That's how you break down a source. The state determines all that is morally valuable. So now we're going to use some evidence to illustrate what the perspective is saying. For example, in Nazi Germany, indoctrination was used to alter the population's morals concerning euthanasia and genocide. The state determines all that is morally valuable was practiced under Hitler's regime in Germany. The state determines all that is socially valuable. We see this in the case study of Brave New World. The state used breeding and conditioning programs to separate the people into classes. Once separated, the state even controlled the nature of social interactions by establishing what would be social norms, like a lack of true intimacy. So it's also important as you're learning the content of the course to be picking up case studies that can be used to further these perspectives. The state determines all that is materially valuable. Again, in Nazi Germany, the state created the Volkswagen as a way to motivate the workers to focus on the potential reward of future consumerism. It is the right, the ironic and juxtaposed use of it is the right seems to imply that the source is a response to a discussion about rights. Perhaps it serves as a response to a pro-liberalism rant about individual rights and freedoms. So why does the source say it is the right? That's why it says that. The term obligation further highlights the absolute stance of the source. Obligations are not negotiable. One cannot argue against what is obligated. Former U.S. President Abraham Lincoln is remembered as being obligated to tell the truth. This characteristic defined his presidency and his legacy. How absolute is this position? It furthers the argument by clearly stating to monopolize all power and authority. This is a clear rejection of the core principles of liberalism. Key to that would be a rejection of accountability of government and seems to reflect the Leviathan-esque relationship that Hobbes discusses. This is not exclusively a political or an economic source. As the voice quoted then claims, the state should control all aspects of society. This control seems to support the collective principle of the state putting the common good ahead of individual interests. Although this practice had some short-term success, as Stalin used central planning to rapidly industrialize and save the Soviet Union from his own prophesied crushing from the other great powers, in the long term, the absolute nature of totalitarianism soured in the hearts and minds of the Soviet citizens. In Nazi Germany, the state introduced Gleichschaltung and achieved, at least until their defeat during World War II, complete control and coordination over all aspects of society, from the economy to the media, culture, and education. This idea of having unity towards state goals is furthered in the second last sentence, where it proclaimed that individuals and groups constitute one unified integral whole working towards common goals. Source seems to attempt to justify their socioeconomic and political monopoly by proclaiming itself the protector of citizens. Why are we allowed to do this? Why can the state have a monopoly? Well, we're the protector of citizens, a common propaganda tactic of authoritarians. In fact, the idea of being a protector indirectly suggests the presence of an enemy, or enemies of the state that you need protection from, and this leads us to a discussion of scapegoats and adherence to collective norms. The idea of adherence to collective norms is furthered by the claim that the state will provide the citizens with identities. Again, objectors might see parallels with imprisoned dystopias like Huxley's Brave New World, where the state did in fact engineer your life at a genetic level before birth and at a social level after. This sentiment was championed in Italy during the 20th century, when fascist dictator Mussolini claimed that there should be all within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. And you can see, we continue to break it down. The continual bargaining of the source is returned to, as the source suggests that in return for loyalty and service, submission to the state will provide for the welfare and security of the people. This might be meant to persuade the audience that there will be benefits to this relationship. Perhaps the state has either created or responded to an immediate threat to national security, similar to Hitler's use of the Reichstag fire. The use of the term welfare is interesting because in it is the essence of the main argument for economic collectivism, that there will be some economic equality. This may include a generous and even enviable network of universal health care and education. But for liberals like Friedman and Rand, the cost is clear. If we allow the state to interfere in our economic lives, our liberty will be lost. But it appears that this state is taking a big brother-like approach, suggesting that freedom is slavery. So, breaking down language, you can see has many, many steps. And I do it with the students, and then we go over it. But then you might be saying, what if it's a cartoon? What do we do for cartoons? You're talking about language. Those are the easy ones. Why not do a cartoon? Let's do a cartoon. With cartoons, you have a number of tools to find and interpret the perspective. So there you have a cartoon. So keep this cartoon in mind. So, again, big picture, what's on the page? You got two dudes sitting on a bench. They have Citizen B on their shirts there. One guy says to the other guy, well, at least we don't have to worry about anarchy anymore. We have different curfew times being set there. We can't see quite the times, but you can see that they are different. We have a heavy police presence, and we have things that are only available for Citizens B. And we also have cameras watching them. All right, so that's the source. So let's break it down. So identify the visual elements. Take a look at the cartoon as a whole. Make a note of the drawings you see. Make a list of the visual elements, including people, animals, other objects, and the setting or background. Identify the main focus of the cartoon. Find the portion of the cartoon that most stands out. Most often this will be a caricature, which is an exaggeration or a distortion of maybe a person that is familiar. Understand labeling. The cartoonist may use labeling and may label certain elements in the cartoon. This will help identify the different pictures and the ideas of the cartoon. Labels are often paired with symbols. Look for symbols. So, source 2 is a political cartoon that has in the foreground two B citizens appearing unsettled as they sit on a bench surrounded by various and sometimes intimidating symbols of state control. The characterization and division of the citizens seems to present a rigid society similar to, use evidence to further perspective, apartheid South Africa or segregation era America. The main difference might be that even those B citizens that enjoy special privileges seem to be caught in an outlandish relationship with their government. This is word for word the actual sentences that I would be writing as a student, breaking the source down. Now you need to look at the text bubbles. People in a cartoon will often speak to each other in the cartoon. Alternatively, they may think something, read what people are saying in the cartoon. The despair of the citizens is captured as one turns to the other and rations. Well, at least we don't have to worry about anarchy anymore. This may offer some insight into the events preceding the cartoon. Perhaps the citizens facing the threat of anarchy requested the state to seize control. The citizens may be categorized, based upon their potential threat to state security. Under this scenario, it would be the will of the people to sacrifice their principles of individualism in order to enjoy the comfort of collectivism. This is, as Benjamin Franklin suggested, a fallacy, as those who in moments of weakness sacrifice freedom, even temporarily for security, deserve neither. Pay attention to how the visual elements interact with each other. Think about how different symbols are drawn in relation to each other. If there is a person, where is he standing? What is he doing? Is he talking to another one? Is he interacting? Look for juxtaposition. Understanding analogy. The cartoonist may compare two things that are not really alike. This technique may be used if there's a complex topic or an idea that is difficult to understand. By comparing it to something else, it can be easier for the reader to understand. The cartoon juxtaposes the familiar with the non-familiar. In the foreground, we have two citizens sitting on a bench. Very relatable. But surrounding the citizens are various symbols of state oppression that hopefully you cannot relate to. Recognize exaggeration. Artists will often exaggerate or distort certain elements of the drawing to make a point. Some commonly exaggerated pictures might include a character's facial features or other parts of the body. Take note of distortion or exaggeration. Look at the visual elements and pay attention to how they are drawn. People or animals may be exaggerated or distorted. In this one, that police presence was probably distorted, right? Understand symbolism. An artist may use symbols as placeholders for ideas or themes. Look for widely recognized symbols. Some metaphors are commonly used by political cartoonists. When we consider the totality of the instruments of state control, the cameras, the curfews, the segregation, and what appears to be a completely unnecessary and excessive display of police might, it also becomes likely that this scenario will not or may not represent the will of the people, but rather the citizen's words may simply be his parroting of state propaganda used to justify their authoritarianism in light of a fictional threat from anarchist scapegoats. This would parallel Hitler's use of the Jews, Stalin's fear of the kulaks, and Big Brother's perpetual war with the other two global superpowers. Look at minor details. Often the cartoon will have minor details that contribute to the humor or the point of the cartoon. Pictorial symbols convey minor themes or ideas. They are usually found in the background or on the sides of the cartoon. The government's justification of the law and order is shown as the closed caption television is labeled for your protection. That's key, right? That's a minor detail, but it's still key. The rejection and despair of the citizens is furthered as they are shown either without faces and individuality or looking hopelessly at the ground. Their lack of individual identity is similar to those interned in death camps by the Nazi Germans. There, too, the inmates learnt that they should avoid making eye contact with the representatives of the state, as that eye contact could be grounds for their murder. Look for allusions to contemporary events or trends. Some cartoons will link their subject matter to a current event or trend that is widely recognized. Now, at the time of recording this, there's a curfew in Quebec that wasn't in place at the time of actually writing this up. So that's where students could bring in current events to continue the conversation created by the source. That the source could also be a questioning of the usurpation of liberty in times of crisis, as we're seeing in Quebec and Ontario, and to some extent here in Alberta too during the COVID-19 crisis here in early 2021. But this is what I had about the USA Patriot Act. and Islamic jihadism. Look for stereotypes. The hard power displayed by the state seems stereotypical, as most governments are more sophisticated at creating the control shown in the cartoon by through the more deceptive soft power of indoctrination. If you control their hearts and minds, perhaps by creating a cult of personality, or more likely the illusion of participation and choice, then the tanks are no longer needed. So the tank is actually a stereotype. Identify the people involved in the issue. To give you more reference points, find out the names and roles of the people. Maybe use of satire, the use of humor, irony, exaggeration. Recognize irony. An artist may use irony by using words or pictures to describe the opposite of what is, such as what should be. Identify the perspective of this issue. The characters seem to be either so intimidated or so indoctrinated by the state that their position remains mostly hidden. Their despair, and the ironic comment about anarchy seems to suggest that they are aware of but powerless to change their dystopia. Determine the artist's perspective. Perspective of the cartoonist is revealed when one considers, would I want to live in this state as being illustrated? The cartoon emphasizes the oppression, the hopelessness, and therefore the cartoonist would value more individualism. This is a dystopia. Determine the audience. Why is it created? Well, it's created as an Orwellian-esque warning that the audience may be citizens that are currently living in a liberal state, but seem to be oblivious that they're sliding towards an illiberal state or a non-liberal state. This cartoon could be used to promote grassroots active citizenship in an attempt to maintain the legitimacy of liberal states, to protect the Fourth Amendment in the United States, to uphold the Charter rights and freedoms in Canada. And we got lots of other sources too. But we're not going to go through all of them, but there is a link here to a Prezi that we can go through. You may end up seeing a photograph. What do you do with a photograph, you might say? Well, it's the same as a cartoon, right? It's a visual. So with a photograph, with visuals such as this photo, consider the context. What issue inspired the actions? Now, if I'm testing my students on this photograph, it better not be the first time I've talked about protest in class, or about environmentalism in class as a challenge to liberalism, that whole chapter 12 of Social 30. And I probably would have specifically talked about this protest because it is a rather unique one. So in this case, the group protesting are an environmental activist group called Extinction Rebellion Edmonton. Based on that, we can infer, like even if we didn't talk about it, even if we just looked and found the who they are, we can infer what they want based upon their title, their name, that those protesting, are concerned about the collective good, language, right? Pages 71 to 85, Principles of Collectivism, specifically the environmental cost of economic liberalism. So it's a rejection of individualism. It's an embracing of collectivism. It also connects to chapter 12 and much of the related issue 3 of 10.1. A lot of 10 comes back in 30, right? Looking at the context, it is easy to link the source to one of the overall themes of 31, the struggle between individualism, economic self-interest, and collectivism, the common good of having a clean and sustainable biosphere. Another nuance of the source is that it also connects to political liberalism, the actions of the activists, and the impact it has on the motorists exposes the struggle between the competing interests of political individualism and, in this case, the fundamental freedoms of speech, protest, assembly, and the freedom of movement of those motorists that are being inconvenienced by the protest. So, boom, and then you find some evidence, you talk about the proponents, same steps, right? After you explore the context, you can explore the significance of the source, hypothesize what might happen if the problem is not addressed. This is an easy one in an environmental source. Who might oppose the source? The division of society. Obviously, struggle between those who support industries that may have a negative impact on the environment. So if you support oil and natural gas industry, then you may not support the protest. The assignment is about interpreting an ideological perspective. Key to this will be to clearly state what is the solution to the problem that is being presented. The protesters have a perspective. The motorists that are off camera but are part of the scenario, they have a perspective. And the photographer, based upon the angle that he shot the picture, has a perspective. He chose to highlight something at the expense of something else. So with a visual, it is always important to look for more details. Thank you, sir. To further unpack the context, for example, the boat. Activists use it to symbolize the rising oceans due to climate change, and we are all in this boat together. It purposely communicated on it. This could be a reminder that the problem cannot be ignored or escaped, and it will need a collective effort to solve. The bridge, literally a testimony to man's intellect, right? Used to conquer nature. But in this case, by blocking the bridge, #BridgeOut, the activists are demonstrating how inconvenient, life-changing it will be when we lose control over the environment due to climate chaos. The link, why are their arms linked with metal, is to expose how unnatural the modern world is. Other elements within the source include things like the tagline underneath that includes the detail that was a illegal protest. So even that is important, because then it in Social 30 says, what is the responsibility of the Edmonton police here? How should the Edmonton police have responded to this problem? So in summary, the first step of A1 is to interpret 3 sources individually. And as you interpret them, you need to look at what's on the page and then why is it there. And when we look at the what's on the page and why it's there are some steps that we can teach our students. In the what's on the page, think about the theme of the course. And the theme is usually broken down into smaller themes as well, right? And within those smaller themes, there's big rocks. The big rocks is the language of the course. And we should be able to identify big rocks in the visuals or in the actual text, the language that is being presented. Once we see what's on the page, we need to really talk about why is it there. Is there a problem that is being highlighted? How does it either reflect or reject the major themes of the course, but what is the problem that they have within that? And what is the significance of the problem? If left unaddressed, how bad will it get? And can we find a solution to the problem? Is it explicit or implicit? And with regards to the solution that's being presented, are there some values and assumptions that we can attach to it? Ultimately, we can use evidence to further the solution, but we can also use evidence to say that the solution is biased and talk about the division of society surrounding the solution. So we also have a website. If you go to Alberta Ed, there's examples of students writing for A1, and I always have my students take a look, and then they can see, what does an S look like, a PF and an E. So I tell them to just go to Google and type in Social Studies 30-1 examples of writing, and they can see samples of A1 and A2 writing. And I've also scanned, not in a fantastic way, mind you, but I've also scanned all of the old sources that have been used. And I use the sources to make multiple choice questions because they're fantastic sources and they lend themselves as a set to be a set for multiple choice. But also, these are released sources now. I end up using them when I talk about apathy in government. I use it to illustrate, what would be the argument in favor of non-liberalism or authoritarianism. I use it to talk about, when you're breaking down a graph, why might this trend be this way? What has changed in society from 58 to 2008? I might look at it to look at the details within a source. Or I might use these old sources to inspire me to find similar, newer sources. Because if I understand that this is what has been on the diploma in the past, then the diploma in the future is probably going to look similar. So then I may look for sources by the same cartoonist or that's reflecting similar perspectives and therefore build sets of sources around that. All right, so the second half of this is going to be looking at the relationship part of the assignment.